Good morning, everyone. Good morning. My name is David Gentilcore, and I'm, well, it's my privilege to welcome Professor Strang. I'll just say who I am, though. I'm a PI of a ERC Advanced Grant called the Water Cultures of Italy, 1500 to 1900. And in preparing that grant, I absolutely pillaged Professor Strang's works. In particular, I have two copies of The Meaning of Water, one here, one in the UK, just in case. Because I'm sort of that generation of historians when we're in need of big ideas, we turn to social and cultural anthropology. So let me say something about Professor Strang or Veronica, I don't know which, Veronica, yeah, that's good, who has worked extensively in the area of human environmental relationships, and in particular how societies engage with water, both across the world, but also through time, which is why I found the research so interesting. And she has carried out research primarily in the UK, in Australia, and New Zealand. And she now lives in Oxford. She's a professor of anthropology at Durham University. When I first came across Veronica's work, I think you were also director of the Institute for Advanced Studies in Durham, so a very prestigious position, as she's held prestigious fellowships and visiting professorships around the world. Her first was in Ontario, which is nice because that's sort of where I come from. Her books are numerous, but I've already mentioned The Meaning of Water, which I think is absolutely essential reading, and I heartily recommend it to all of you. But her most recent book, in press to look forward to, is called Water Beings, From Nature Worship to the Environmental Crisis, which is published by Reaction. But also a series of books, What Anthropologists Do, which is always good for us historians, Water, Nature and Culture, 2015, Gardening the World, Agency, Identity and the Ownership of Water, 2009, Uncommon Ground, Cultural Landscapes and Environmental Values, 1997, and 1988, this was the fruit of the work in Ontario, A Citizen's Guide to Environmental Assessment. So that gives you an idea of the range of Veronica's interests and expertise. Today, she's going to be talking about Turning the Tide, Indigenous Water Beings and Multi-Species Democracy. Thank you, Veronica.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David, for that. That one, okay. Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Yes, that is better, isn't it? Well, firstly, I want to say thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this amazing Talanoa Forum. It's always lovely to come to Venice. And in this case, I also get to reconnect with Pacific and Aotearoa New Zealand colleagues, which is a particular pleasure. And today's topic is very close to my heart. As some of you will know, I have a long-standing interest in human and non-human rights to water and the potential for non-anthropocentric partnerships and pan-species democracy. So today, to start our discussion on this topic, I'm going to begin with a brief overview of the legal issues pertaining to non-human rights, and then drawing on a couple of case studies from my research in Australia and New Zealand, I'm going to talk about the role that Indigenous water beings such as taniwha and rainbow serpents have in communicating alternate ideas about human, non-human relations, law, and personhood. But first, let's just take stock briefly of where the international debates are going in relation to water and human and non-human rights. There's very broad acceptance of human rights to water. These are enshrined in international law with the Declaration of Human Rights to Water by the UN in the General Assembly in 2010. And the declaration states that people are rights holders, states are duty bearers of providing water and sanitation services, and rights holders can claim their rights, and duty bearers must guarantee the rights to water and sanitation equally and without discrimination, which sounds like a very good goal. We don't seem to have quite got there yet. But having rights to basically clean drinking water and hygiene facilities necessary for human health isn't the same as having enough water to sustain traditional lifeways and homelands. It's not the same as having rights to exert control over water flows or to be able to protect fresh and saltwater bodies. Water is always reflective of political realities, and the level of rights to water that people have in real terms accurately mirrors the power relations between and within societies. And this is equally true when it comes to talking about non-human rights to water and sufficient water. The extent to which these rights are upheld directly reflects the relations of power between human and non-human beings. And as you'll know, the range of here is from reciprocal partnerships promoted often by Indigenous communities to brutally exploitative relationships, which in the case of water lead to over-abstraction, overuse, careless pollution, and in broader ecosystemic terms to excessive predation or harvesting, for example, of freshwater and marine species, or the destruction of essential habitats. Now, environmental legislation around the world provides some implicit non-human rights to clean and sufficient water, for example, in regulations forbidding pollution or penalizing polluters, in requirements to maintain minimum flows in river ecosystems to sustain them and their native species. But as less than 1% of rivers in Europe actually meet the European Water Directive intended to ensure their well-being, and there's similar degradation of river systems around the world, with the Colorado River, the Amazon Basin, the Murray-Darling in Australia provide very sobering examples. And intensive farming and hydroelectric generation has impacted rivers also in places like New Zealand, which people imagine to be very green and verdant. And irrigation creates massive ecological problems in Australia, and the picture is similar elsewhere. So it's quite clear that the level of protection for non-human rights that's provided in environmental legislation is very far from adequate. But of course, there's growing awareness that the environmental crisis is very much a water crisis, so there has been increasing pressure to establish more meaningful rights for non-human beings and ecosystems. So we have a lot of pressure on the UN to assure a declaration upholding non-human rights to water as well, and this has been led very much by people like the lawyer and activist Polly Higgins, whose advocates for Earth Law, as it's become known, are pushing for ecocide to be declared an international crime by the International Court for Criminal Justice, alongside genocide and war crimes and crimes against humanity. And there are calls for more robust environmental legislation and effective enforcement of it, of existing laws even. There's the Half Earth movement, which you may have heard of, which suggests that we need to return at least half the Earth to non-human beings to ensure their survival. And just this morning on the news, the latest extinction figures are so depressing and alarming that you can really see why people are pushing for these things. But it remains that with an ever-increasing human population and a dominant commitment to capitalism, growth and development, with the major inequalities in power, ensures that exploitation of the non-human domain is continuing. And so we are, as I said, reaching very frightening levels of extinction, and they have this spectre of chaos emerging from critical changes in the Earth's climate. So there are many groups, and hopefully they're coalescing, Indigenous communities, academics, environmental organizations, who recognize the need for a paradigmatic shift in how we think about and engage with the non-human domain. So what would this look like? I think the first thing that needs to be tackled is a foundational problem, the persistent ontological dualism that divides nature and culture. This conceptual division between ourselves and the rest of the world rests on assumptions about human exceptionalism and rights to dominion over nature. And of course, this was very firmly established with the emergence of the major monotheisms that's dominated Western thinking since then and has been carried around the globe via colonial hegemony and trade ever since. And this casts nature as an alienated other, objectifies it as a resource, and permits societies to act upon it freely and to externalize to it the costs of their activities. And it is above all an unequal relationship in which non-human beings and ecosystems have no voice, no agency, no rights, and they must depend on the stewardship of humankind for their protection. So what is emerging now is a very lively intellectual and political critique of this anthropocentricity, demanding greater acknowledgement of the reality that while highly instrumental human approaches to material environment have become the norm, humankind is not the sole creator of the world that we inhabit. It is rather a co-creation arising from the activities of all living species and systems, acting upon us, acting upon each other, and from water and other materials and elements, such as weather, acting in accord with their physical properties and behaviors. Now, of course, that understanding is not new, and certainly not to many indigenous peoples whose cosmological frameworks have always conceptualized the world as an indivisible whole of coexisting living kinds, and who've retained visions of reciprocal partnerships with the non-human domain. And generally these are accompanied by permanent, inalienable relationships with place, and such worldviews are therefore intrinsically more respectful of non-human needs and interests, recognizing that their long-term well-being and that of humankind are mutually interdependent and really cannot be separated. And such views are fundamentally opposed to modes of interaction that are exploit, move on, leave the costs behind, and devolve them to future generations. So many indigenous communities in North and South America and Central America, Canada, the Arctic, Australia, Aotearoa, New Zealand, are fighting to protect their homelands and waters from the damage caused by multinationals or larger societies' desires to extract fossil fuels, minerals, building materials, to impose infrastructures, irrigate crops, expand industrial agriculture, extend urban areas, and to harvest resources. And there have been some successes. Indigenous groups in Ecuador have managed to block some extractive activities and have persuaded their government to enshrine non-human rights for Pachamama, Mother Earth, in the country's constitution. And as the name indicates, such worldviews assign personhood to the non-human domain. And this acknowledgement of the social presence of other living kinds, as well, is illustrated by other attempts in Colombia, India, and elsewhere to have rivers and forests legally declared to have personhood. And some very significant progress has been achieved by Maori communities in Aotearoa, New Zealand, who succeeded in establishing the legal rights of personhood for the Te Urewera Forest in 2014 and for the Whanganui River in 2017. And this provides those ecosystems with rights of personhood similar to those provided to corporations. And this is underlined by the definition of the river in accord with Maori beliefs as a living ancestor, Te Awa Tupua. And the legal ruling on the Whanganui River explains how these rights are articulated by Maori representatives called Taupu Tupua, whose role is to uphold these rights in decision-making processes. And reflecting the relationship between Maori iwis and the river, the ruling establishes that these representatives are empowered, as follows, to act and speak for, on behalf of Te Awa Tupua, to promote and protect the health and well-being of Te Awa Tupua, to perform landowner functions with respect to land vested in Te Awa Tupua, to maintain the Te Awa Tupua register of people qualified to hear and determine applications under the Resource Management Act for resource consents for activities involving the river and affecting it, and to administer a trust fund to support its health and well-being. Now, as I'm sure we're going to discuss later today, the legal acknowledgement of personhood of non-human beings and ecosystems is regarded as very helpful by some, but it's also raised concerns, amongst others, about the introduction of what are seen as putatively religious beliefs into secular law. I would suggest myself that it's more a matter of acknowledging the living presence of other than human beings and establishing an ethical requirement to protect their fundamental rights, but I'm sure that's a question we might discuss. But in reality, there are many cultural views of non-human beings as persons. So, for example, the Yupik in the Arctic region say the world contains no others, only persons. And the idea of non-human beings having personhood is far from absent, even in industrialized societies. Anthropological studies of human-animal relations have often highlighted people's relationships with domesticated animals and pets who become encompassed as kin, and often more so than people themselves, if my family is anything to go by. And they're socially accepted as persons and kin. And sometimes this has led to major political conflicts as well, impassioned arguments about the great apes debates of the 1990s, whose activists sought to protect primates from medical experimentation and laid the foundations of the current animal rights movement. And in relation to water, even the most secular views accept that rivers and aquatic ecosystems are living entities. And although these views might balk at assigning personhood to them, there is some potential common ground here with Indigenous perspectives envisaging them as living ancestors. Which brings me to my first case study about water beings. And just to give you a little bit of background, I've recently completed a major comparative study of culturally and historically diverse water beings around the world. This was so much fun. And it explores how they reveal very diverse societal trajectories in human environmental relationships. And this is a result of an abiding fascination, one might say long-term obsession. But the main reason that I like these water beings so much is that they are a fantastic narrative device because they reveal the dynamics of diverse human engagements with water. So we're going to dip into a little bit of that material today. But let me start by explaining what I mean by water beings in general, because these are deities or ancestral beings representing water, and they appear all over the world throughout human history, and they remain very central to multiple belief systems. And the reason for this ubiquity is that they are essentially composed of water. They're manifestations of its material properties and behaviors. And as you can see from these images, although they're very culturally diverse, they have some common characteristics. They're like a sort of family of ideas. They are typically serpentine. Like water, they reflect the colors and patterns of water. They follow hydrological cycles circulating between the earth and the sky in a variety of ways. They have wings quite often. Sometimes they spit lightning and fire, and we tend to talk about them as dragons, but they're fundamentally the celestial half of the hydrological cycles. And they represent that water that is airborne, if you like. And like water, or rather as water, they feature centrally in many stories of cosmogenesis. So the world is often made out of their bodies, and in this sense, they really are primary ancestors. They create all living kinds, including humankind, and there's a very nice resonance here with scientific knowledge that human beings, all living beings, emerged from ancient oceans, and even when they evolved sufficiently to haul themselves out of the water and become terrestrial, they brought the sea with them. They remained entirely dependent on being irrigated by water. And there's a lovely book by Diana and Mark McMenamin called The Hypersea, which describes the fact that we are all connected by water, even on terrestrial terms. And as generative sources of water, water beings are often hybrid in form. They physically embody whatever local life forms they generate, and this gives them their geographic and cultural particularity as well. So they might feature kangaroo heads and crocodile scales in Australia, or as in this image from the west coast of Canada and North America, they might have a bear or wolf head. They may have seal or whale-like features in the Arctic, take anaconda form in South America, and bear the patterns of boa constrictors in Africa. And their major purpose is to maintain life flows. They bring the annual rains, or where they're punitive, they withhold it or bring too much of it. And they create floods and droughts. Or one might say, therefore, that in personifying the powers of water, they manifest the most fundamental agency of the non-human domain. And embodying this central role in human and non-human lives, they have for millennia been deeply venerated, worshipped, propitiated, and in many particular indigenous societies, they're still central to traditional belief systems. So what has happened to water beings in larger societies over time is very revealing of key changes in human, non-human relationships. And it's for this reason that my research in this area follows their fortunes within the very different historical trajectories that societies have taken in their relationships with the non-human domain. And it considers why and how this has led to the widespread adoption of wholly unsustainable practices and the current environmental crisis. And the book will be out in February. So my first case study from this research that we're focusing on today comes from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and it summarizes some work that I did in 2008 and 9 with my colleagues Mark Bussey and our research assistant Geraldine Reid at the University of Auckland. And this was work at the request of the Maori Council. Because drawing on the Treaty of Waitangi, signed in 1840, the case entailed an attempt to reclaim a site called Taniwha Springs, pictured here, which had been appropriated in 1966 under the Public Works Act to supply water to nearby Rotorua. And in a broader claim, the council aimed to establish Maori rights to water and ensure that Maori had a strong voice in the use and management of rivers and marine waters. And the key part of our anthropological task, as you would expect from anthropologists, was to bring comparative material together from Indigenous communities around the world to consider how other Indigenous groups were handling precisely these kinds of conflicts, which are, of course, everywhere, and who are similarly seeking to exercise their rights to protect rivers and water bodies and marine areas. So a bit of context might be helpful for some of you who are not familiar with this part of the world, and I hope my Maori colleagues will forgive a very simplified sketch of their cultural traditions. As in many stories of cosmogenesis, Maori beliefs describe a world that is created out of chaos, te kore, in which deities or atua, representing each aspect of the environment, evolving out of energy, light, and darkness. Ranganui, the Sky Father, Papatuanuku, the Earth Mother, produced progeny, including Tangaroa, who Nagahui mentioned just yesterday, the god of the sea, lakes, and rivers. And both, like other water deities, Tangaroa is both a source of life and a potentially destructive force. Water beings always have that dual capacity. And there's a deeper underworld inhabited by Ruamoko, the god of earthquakes and volcanoes. And the sea is an important other world in which it's a fluid realm from which spiritual being comes and resides. And in this story of cosmic origins, water serpent beings, or Taniwha, are world creators. So, for example, two Taniwha, Vaitaitai and Aki, in attempting to reach the Cook Strait from their nearby lake, scoop out the bay of Wellington Harbour, and further north, a female Taniwha, Araituuru, gives birth to 11 sons who dig the trenches that become the branches of Hokianga Harbour, and she remains there deep in a cave. And there are many other such stories in which the actions of Maori water beings create a sentient land and waterscape where they take up residence as protective ancestral beings embodying the Maori, the power of the waters, and the literally substantial and spiritual connections between local tribes, or iwis, and their homelands. And they continue to generate life and to provide resources to local communities, and they retain an important role as the guardians of sacred sites, rivers, and water bodies. And like other water beings, Taniwha incorporate the features of local species, especially aquatic creatures, and they're often represented with fish scales and the sinuous bodies of freshwater eels that are a very popular food source. They sometimes have wings, sometimes they're bicephalous in having two heads, and their heads might be dragon-like, or they might have highly stylized human faces. In fact, their resemblance to other water beings and dragons in other parts of the world is such that when Europeans arrived with coins showing St. George, the dragon was immediately recognized as a Taniwha, apparently. And you can see it particularly in this image from the courthouse in Rotorua. And like other major water beings, Taniwha provide sustenance, but they can also be punitive, punishing people who fail to respect sacred places and the power of the gods. And that might involve swallowing people or causing floods. And they're very powerful manifestations of the capacities of water to act upon the world, sometimes very assertively. So it's entirely logical that they should feature strongly in Maori efforts to uphold cultural beliefs and values and to promote respectful relationships with water bodies. So Taniwha have been called upon regularly to challenge plans for developments such as a metro system in Auckland, further disrupting a river that has already been driven underground, and to resist the development of motorways cutting through important places. And of course, in this cultural context, springs are particularly important. They're defined under the 1840 treaty as taonga, or sacred, so they embody the life force of the related people. They're important sites for healing and meditation, and iwis have a reciprocal role as kaitiaki, or guardians, in protecting them. So in the case of Taniwha Springs, stories about the resident Taniwha, Pekehawa, are central to the identity of the local iwi, and their traditional stories describe how the river was formed by the journey of this great Taniwha as he travelled to his home. And as in Australia, you find this very often, harm to those springs, which embodies this important Taniwha, is believed to have commensurate impact on the local community's health and well-being. But in 1966, the springs were appropriated, and the Rotorua District Council, as it was then, installed a noisy pumping station and began to abstract increasing amounts of water for the growing urban areas, to the extent that local ecosystems were affected. This and the pollution of the nearby lake in Rotorua was a matter of growing concern to the Maori community, not just economically, but in its effect on local fishing and watercress gathering, but in social and spiritual terms. And as my colleagues and I reported, activities that threaten to destroy or have destroyed these resources also destroy the ability of Maori to hand these taonga to future generations. And this is why the pollution of Lake Rotorua and the over-abstraction of water at Taniwha Springs are more than environmental and economic matters. They are also social and cultural issues that decrease people's mana and seriously disrupt their identity. But the council remained determined to continue to abstract water, and in 2004 they were given permission to do so for another decade, but they were told that eventually you'll have to find an alternative source. And the legal battle intensified in 2008, which is when we were brought in to help. And in 2015, the council finally agreed to return the springs to the local iwi, with the surrounding land being formally returned in 2018. So the local iwi has now established more traditional co-management structure, working with the council and to ensure that their water bodies are protected. As they say, they want their rivers and springs to be strong, clear and healthy for future generations. And for them, as a recent report of their activities observed, this entails listening to the voice of the Taniwha. But rising Maori concerns about intensifying land and water use and pollution and so forth have driven similar battles across Aotearoa, New Zealand. As I noted at the outset, this led to a larger claim by the Maori Council to re-establish the Indigenous community's rights to water. And this travelled through the Waitangi Tribunal, through the High Court, and to the Supreme Court. And like governments in Australia and Canada, the Crown distinguishes rights from ownership. But it conceded that Maori people had an obligation, customary rights to water. And in 2012, the Supreme Court ruled that any process of water privatisation must remain subject to an obligation to act consistently with the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, in effect upholding Maori rights to maintain customary relationships with waterways. And this has provided some support to communities to be directly involved in and influential in decisions about what happens to water and so forth. And in this ongoing debate, their Taniwha continue to play an important role. My second case study requires us to leap across the Tasman Sea to northern Australia, and it draws on many years of ethnographic research on the Mitchell River in Cape York and in South Queensland on the Brisbane River. And in this work, I have been asked, it might be more accurate to say, instructed by Indigenous elders to assist their communities by articulating beliefs and values in wider social and political arena. So I've tried to do so, and I've therefore written quite extensively about rainbow serpents over the years. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with Aboriginal culture, the rainbow serpent is a primary ancestral being throughout Indigenous Australia, and it has been, according to the archaeological record, for many millennia. And it manifests and personifies the powers of water and is the source of all life. And like most water beings, it has a central role in cosmogenesis. It emerged from the land within the dreaming to form the land and waterscape. It spat or spewed out all living kinds, including humankind, and then it sat down back into the land, where it has remained as a powerful ancestral force. It is therefore the creator of all of the totemic ancestral beings, mostly non-human in form, who co-created the world and whose foundational activities are passed from one generation to the next in stories and songlines and dances, rituals, art, and material culture. And like many water beings, the rainbow serpent represents a hydrotheological cycle. So in practical terms, it brings the rains, it ensures the flows of water between earth and sky and through the land, and it can be beneficent in providing rain and resources, or again, punitive in punishing transgressions such as against ancestral law, for example, trespass into sacred sites or the misuse of resources. It's also the source of the law itself. It generates the holistic traditional knowledge that is central to successful hunting and gathering. And at appropriate life stages, people are introduced with sacred and secret knowledge, which they acquire in order to become elders and provide gerontocratic leadership to Indigenous communities. And theologically, the rainbow serpent is the source of the human spirit. It resides in the land, or more accurately in the dreaming, which is not so much a time as a place. People usually say where rather than when, because really this is an invisible, non-material dimension that coexists with the visible material world. And spiritual life is contained in this pool of ancestral power held in the land or in this hidden dimension. And the rainbow serpent generates each human spirit from a home water place, usually within clan land, and it enervates the fetus in a woman's womb. And its arrival is signalled by a strange event, usually shown to the father, such as a particular bird call or just something unusual that happens. And as well as carrying the spirit into material being, incarnating the person, it brings consciousness. It locates each individual within a totemic clan and a network of kin, and it provides them with rights to resources as well as obligations to take care of the clan and the clan estate, commonly described as country. And this is a permanent relationship. People cannot be alienated from their homelands, even if they're forced to move away from it. And at the end of life, a person's spirit has to be ritually sung back to its original home place, to be reunited with the ancestral home. And in this sense, the rainbow serpent, as you see, is a sort of theological cycle that carries each person through material and non-material dimensions of being. So clearly this is a centrally important water being, a powerful authority figure that is part of a sentient land and waterscape, which is sensitive and responsive to human actions. So like the Taniwha across the Tasman, the well-being of the rainbow serpent and that of related Aboriginal communities is interdependent. So any harm to the rainbow serpent caused, for example, by mining into its domain or polluting water bodies constitutes harm to the related Indigenous community. And it is therefore fiercely protective of them and their country and can be invoked to confront threats to their mutual well-being. Which brings me to the specifics of a case study which concerns a recent legal battle between the Indigenous community on the Tiwi Islands, which as you can see is way up in the north there, or just off Darwin, and a multinational oil and gas company, Santos. And the corporation initiated an offshore gas drilling project about 140 kilometers north of the Tiwi Islands. And it aimed to construct a number of drilling platforms to extract hydrocarbons, i.e. natural gas, from the seabed, and a subsea gas pipeline to send this to Darwin, to a liquid gas facility. And the project enabled an investment of about 4.7 billion Australian dollars, which is about 3.6 billion US dollars, with a view to extending these activities to the Darwin facility for another 20 years. Now, given that the claim was heavily concerned with water issues and with a sea country of an Indigenous community, I was asked to provide an independent expert report. And this is legally a very impartial position in which neither party in the case is allowed to influence you in any way, which is quite a good place from which to add some anthropological expertise to the proceedings. And the Tiwi Islanders also had their own advocates, an applied anthropologist called Gareth Lewis, and a special legal counsel from the Environmental Defenders Office in Darwin, which is a charity that is devoted to environmental law. And now, this case is still ongoing, so I can only discuss what's already in the public domain. But in brief, the legal case centered upon a claim by the Tiwi Island traditional owners that Santos had failed to meet its legal obligations to consult them about his plans. And they asserted that the National Offshore Petroleum Safety Management Authority, NOPSEMA, had given the corporation a go-ahead to go drilling without making sure that this consultation had taken place properly. And Santos asserted that it had consulted with the Tiwi Islanders via its land council. It had sent them a couple of emails and copies of a very lengthy technical report. And this report provided very detailed accounts of the planned drilling activities and the marine species and ecosystems that might be vulnerable to impacts from their activities, and particularly from unplanned events, by which they mean an oil spill. And it also acknowledged, briefly, that the marine areas concerned contained important sea country for the Tiwi Islanders. The Tiwi Islanders are very small, with just two main islands, Bathurst and Melville, covering just over 8,000 square kilometres. And the Indigenous community is also small. There's only a couple of thousand people in the whole of the Tiwi Islands. And like many Aboriginal communities in Northern Australia, it's comprised of a language group subdivided into a number of clans and their estates, or country, as it's called, and the community is led by its elders, or as they're commonly described, the traditional owners. And it's worth noting that although it is an important representative body and an intermediary, the Land Council is not the primary authority in such matters. This authority and governance more generally still lies with the elders, the traditional owners. And central to this case is a reality that this is a community whose lifeways have for millennia been entirely reliant on its relationship with the marine ecosystems. And in an indigenous worldview, this is not, as exists in Western systems, there's no meaningful division between land and sea. Traditional ecological knowledge encompasses water bodies. It includes often hidden aquifers, underground hydrological flows, and such knowledge flows readily out into sea country. So Stephen Davis, writing about this, notes that Tiwi ancestral beings entered the land through watercourses. Bathurst and Melville Islands are indented with bays, rivers, creeks, all carrying life-sustaining significance to Tiwi land as arteries and blood vessels sustain the body and reach into every part of it. So in this cultural context, the sea is not some kind of amorphous mass, but a lively and varied waterscape composed of unique reefs and shoals and marine habitats and diverse species and very important totemic beings. It contains major songlines, and these can be very, very extensive, linking groups across large areas. So, for example, there are stories in Arnhem Land communities describing the underground journey of a mother rainbow serpent that actually links Macassar with the northern Australian coast, which is a distance of nearly 1,500 kilometres. And as one Tiwi Island elders said, our songlines connect us right up from sea country to deep water. And containing songlines and sacred sites, sea country is composed in part by the presence and movement of totemic ancestral beings. So, for example, in this part of the world, turtles are very important totemic beings, and they're the clan totem of the elder who initiated the claim, Dennis Tipakablika. And as they have been tracked travelling very extensively out to sea, including to the area where these drill platforms are, this is very clearly something that is encompassed in sea country. And this extends the sea country out to those areas, and it's plain from Santos's own reports that all of the marine ecosystems and coastlines are very vulnerable to immediate and longer-term impacts of an unplanned event, by which they mean an oil spill, as I said. Other experts have warned that even without a major oil spill, the project will result in significant pollution. So no wonder, then, that the Tiwi Islanders, with their spiritual, social, and economic existence dependent on their sea country, became increasingly concerned as information about these risks began to filter through. And as in so many Indigenous communities, their deepest concerns were about the potential harm caused to their local rainbow serpent called Ampiji. The Tiwi Islanders describe a female rainbow serpent being, Ampiji, who, having created the sea in the dreaming, still inhabits and personifies the aquatic domain in and around the Tiwi Islands, and who travels, moves, is present in fresh and saltwater bodies, multiply manifesting itself in different places. And as I noted earlier in stories about rainbow serpent beings, the Ampiji generates human spirits, putapawi, and these must be returned via mortuary rituals to her so that their spirit goes past out to sea, as it's put there. So in the Tiwi Islands, the Aboriginal Australian rainbow serpent remains central as a personification of the generative power of water. They simultaneously embody the ancestral relations between Indigenous people and the non-human domain, and they underscore the co-identification, the interdependence, and the egalitarian reciprocity underpinning those relationships. So the Tiwi elders told the court that Ampiji would be very angry and vengeful if their sea country was invaded in this way. And they explained, as they put it, when someone drills underground or in the sea, and it's close to the proximity of your land or your boundary in a whitefellow way, in our way, spiritually, they're drilling a hole in our body. So the rainbow serpent flows through this case, representing the sanctity of Indigenous relationships with water and land, and the need to protect these relationships and ensure that human and non-human rights to survive and flourish are jointly upheld. So both of these case studies illustrate some key issues for us. The tensions between dualistic visions of nature and culture, in which nature is merely an objectified asset to be acted upon, and indigenous and alternate views in which the world is an indivisible whole co-created by all living kinds and ecosystems. And these represent a basic conflict between neoliberal aims to exploit and profit from material resources and assure continued growth and development, and a critique that questions the wisdom and the ethics of such unsustainable short-termism and seeks to protect the world, as Indigenous elders put it, for future generations. And this raises some very key questions about human and non-human rights and the need for more inclusive and egalitarian forms of pan-species democracy that uphold these rights. And in Australia and New Zealand and the Americas, the Arctic and Africa, water beings make waves in these debates. They bring into them a tidal flow of ideas about different life ways in which the co-creativity and powers of the non-human domain are fully recognized and respected, in which there are more egalitarian reciprocal modes of human-non-human engagement, and which are characterized by values that are orientated towards practices seeking to ensure the collective long-term well-being of human and non-human beings. So water beings' effectiveness as representations of alternative beliefs and values is illustrated by the outcome of the Tiwi case, although it's not all over yet. But at the end of September, the federal court ruled that Santos had indeed failed to consult the Tiwi Island traditional owners and must cease its activities. And this decision will, of course, be appealed. But even if the drilling proceeds, it will lead, at the very least, to a situation in which the Tiwi Islanders can demand higher levels of care in the extractive process. They can perhaps seek agreement that Santos will use things like double-hulled vessels, cease drilling in certain types of weather. But of much greater importance is that this unprecedented outcome will have ramifications for Indigenous rights in relation to extractive industries around the world, because this case has been covered very considerably internationally. And it is telling the big multinationals that they cannot ignore Indigenous voices. And it supports the multiple efforts being made to establish different kinds of human and non-human rights and to protect living kinds. So by articulating alternate beliefs and values, the water beings in this case support new mechanisms for upholding non-human rights. For example, international law that ensures that whether they're regarded as persons or not, rivers and their non-human inhabitants are legally protected from ecocide. They help to make the case for the kinds of non-anthropocentric democracy that I've described elsewhere, a vision of reimagining communities in which councils of experts are appointed to represent the needs and interests of non-human beings and ecosystems. And it supports the notion of a UN declaration for the rights of nature, although my personal view is that this is still upholding a rather dualistic vision, and it'd be more radical to have a UN declaration of the rights of all living kinds and ecosystems. So imagine, for example, a declaration that actually enlarged to create a single world in which all living beings and ecosystems were right holders, and states are duty bearers to provide clean and sufficient water for their health and well-being, and that all rights holders could claim their rights, and duty bearers must guarantee their rights to water equally and without discrimination. And I think that this would be more forward-thinking than actually having two different sets of rights. And along the same lines, I would do away with the alienating dualism in UN notions of cultural and natural heritage, and acknowledge the collective co-creativity of human and non-human beings by having a single vision of biocultural heritage. And these are, in my view, the kind of ontological, political, and practical changes that are needed to turn the tide to the extent that all living kinds can survive and flourish now and in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Veronica. You can, maybe you can see why someone might want to turn to Veronica's work for inspiration, especially about, well, big concepts and ideas. I mean, when she started talking, I was immediately struck, we probably all were, by the paradox of attributing personhood to non-human beings and to ecosystems when it's personhood that got us into this mess in the first place. But I think towards the end, with this fascinating case study, Veronica really illustrated the contribution that environmental anthropology can make, or I would say anthropology in action, something like this. And it leaves us with some hope that, yeah, we might be going in a better direction. I don't know. Anyway, I'll open the floor to questions and discussion. Veronica does ask that you speak loudly and clearly. I don't know if there's a microphone. Yeah, there is a microphone circulating, so if you'd please use that. Oh, okay, I don't know quite how to, oh yeah, okay.
Hi, thank you first of all for your, can you hear me well? Okay, so thank you first of all for sharing your research and work with us. So as environmental humanities students, of course, we consider your work extremely valuable, especially in a time of environmental struggles. However, considering the deeply rooted differences in the so-called Western world and indigenous world, is it really possible to translate the indigenous perspective of non-human entities to the general public? And if so, how do we do that in the most practical sense?
Thank you. That's a really helpful question. How do we translate indigenous perspectives into sort of the broader debates? I don't know how much we need to translate them, because I think that indigenous people are speaking into these debates very directly as well. But I think that the way I see this being helpful is, for me, anthropology is a kind of connective meta-discourse, if you like, so that we learn all the time from all of the different communities, not just indigenous communities, but all the different perspectives that feed into our understanding of human being and human behavior. And so, in a sense, I see anthropology as providing a kind of connective bridging mechanism, if you like, and also a set of theoretical toolkits for thinking about human behavior. I mean, that's what anthropology is really for. But my hope really is that what you have is sort of multiple voices articulating very different and alternate visions of the world. And what we try to create a fora in which those voices can meet and have Talanoa, if you like. And so the UN, in theory, provides one of those. And it's a very cumbersome mechanism, but it's also a very important mechanism for international dialogue in which cultural diversity is pooled to discuss the kind of global issues that we are all facing collectively. And for me, anthropology provides another kind of meta-discursive way of having that of enabling an international conversation. And then there are all the wonderful linkages now occurring between indigenous communities that have connected with each other. And part of this is down to contemporary communications technologies, that people can now have international conversations, and you go to a UN meeting in The Hague, and there's all these other people arriving by Zoom or in person, participating in that conversation. So I think, in a sense, your question is, it's already happening. And it's already happening because people are having those kinds of conversations very actively. And my hope is that these different movements and ideas of indigenous activism, feminism, environmental activism, social justice movements will coalesce sufficiently that we'll get a tipping point in which things actually do start to change. And that's the thing that I'm kind of holding on to in terms of hope for making the kind of shifts that are needed. But it's almost like a kind of critical mass that needs to happen. So I think that anything we can do to bring those alternate ideas into the conversation is valuable. So I do quite a lot of work with UNESCO and the UN, and I'm always trying to smuggle these very radical and alternate ideas into the room, and progress is being made. So when I first started working with UNESCO, and the whole notion of non-human rights just wasn't happening at all. And they have moved very slowly. I mean, honestly, when you work with UN, you feel like you're doing homeopathy. You have so little effect. But it does make a difference, because slowly but surely they start, oh, we need nature-based solutions. Well, what do we mean by nature-based solutions? Well, they mean working with nature rather than on nature. So, okay, so that's actually quite an important step. And then in their next report, they started talking about we need to pay attention to alternative values. So they start listening to all these different value systems coming in. So slowly, painfully, it is starting to happen, I think. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. Also, it made another question come, but I will ask it maybe later. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. In your works, you are advocating for a pan-species democracy that takes into consideration both the needs of human and non-human species. However, present democracies are already limited in representing even human needs.
Can you shout a bit louder?
Yes, sure. Present democracies are already limited in presenting human needs when it comes to, for example, representing and hearing minorities and tackling the climate crisis. Therefore, can we expect them to properly represent the non-human entities as well? We rather should rethink the current democratic institutions in order to build a new system integrating humans and non-humans alike. How do we go about this?
No, it's a very good question. I mean, we're not doing so well with human democracy, let's be honest. and this is partly because of the sort of radical inequalities that continue to widen rather than narrow. But in a sense, this is the same problem that needed to be addressed. So this is why this critique necessarily goes to the heart of neoliberal values about competition and inequality. And it is about as much about social justice as it is about ecological justice. And in both cases, inequality is the problem that needs to be tackled, so that, that huge scale of hierarchy in which human rights are very often not upheld needs to be extended to include the rights of non-human beings. And if we don't do that at the same time, and this is always the problem, I think you've put your finger on an important problem that is always seen as a trade-off. Well, if we look after conservation, we can't look after the communities that are dependent on those. And you see this a lot in Africa, in conservation areas and so forth, where, oh, well, we need the tourist income and we need the agriculture, or no, we need to protect the elephants and the tigers or whatever. And it's seen as a trade-off. But this is a false argument, because you cannot protect human rights if you don't have functioning, flourishing ecosystems. And they're composed of all of their inhabitants. So in a sense, you kind of really have to tackle both at once, I think. So yeah, I take your point. It seems an almost impossible goal when we don't even get the human stuff right. But if we keep waiting till we get the human stuff right, well, how many species are there going to be left for us to exploit? So we really need to do both. You cannot have justice for humankind without justice for the non-human domain, I would say.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. My question is more related to the tension between the way the government approaches the ecosystem as a territory that is always mapped, quantified, that always has fixed borders, and the way the indigenous community approaches it is like in a more fluid way, and also like how can we talk about personhoods of something as flexible and fluid as a river and the water body. How do you approach it in this kind of framework? Thank you.
Thank you. That's several questions there. I think you make a very important point about quantifying things. And we live in a world in which things are not seen to be valuable unless they can be quantified. And this came up very powerfully in the Tiwi Island case, because the Santos were saying, well, where's the boundary of their sea country? How far out does it go? How many kilometers does it extend? And the Tiwi Islands are going, what does that mean? You know, that's not a meaningful way to think about these things. It extends wherever the totemic beings are. It extends wherever the song lines are. It extends wherever the rainbow serpent travels. And this is a very stark contrast between counting the few things that can be measured and thinking about the things that really matter, which are very often things that can't be measured at all. And I think that what we need to do is be quite critical of that sort of obsession with measuring and encompass a very different way of understanding the world that isn't quantifying at all, because, you know, it's too easy to get caught in a trap. If you can't measure it, it doesn't count. And it does, of course, count. So there's that. And then the tension between sort of forms of governance. I mean, we do struggle, I think, with governments that are locked into notions of growth as a necessity. And I worry that the discourses about circular economies or degrowth economies is not getting as much traction as it needs to. And yet, when you look historically, and we can turn to our historians for this, human societies have actually maintained quite circular economies for very long periods of time. And growth and expansion is not a sort of given as a necessity. If you can run economies in very different kinds of ways, but you need a much less competitive type of approach, and this is why neoliberalism lies at the heart of the problem. Yeah. Does that give you the answer?
You have a question here up at the front, and then one.
It was just a comment, really. Like when you said something.
Sorry, can you have the mic?
It's just a comment, really, with regards to your comment about progress, particularly like, you know, with those that are living in the global south, you know, developing countries context and indigenous context, that so much of what we are told about progress, you know, that's been facilitated by aid and things like that, it's about clearing the land and building apartments. Yeah. You know, and then that's the image that we've been fed to us, that is, you know, owning, you know, building an apartment, owning a property, equates to success. You know, making money is success, but, you know, but not making nature. And I think so long as we're sort of dependent on the current capitalist values and economic systems, we still have to keep fighting for it. So it's just as a comment.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's it. Thank you very much, Yuki. That's a nice point about the need to critique notions of progress as being expansive. But of course, you know, we hear a lot about climate change and temperature. And in some ways, I think this is sometimes a red herring because it distracts from exactly the problem that you've put your finger on, which is the constant clearance of natural habitats, non-human habitats, to extend agriculture. And you know, in my work on river catchments, I see this a lot, that everywhere you go in the world, everywhere, land is being cleared for agriculture and development and expanding urban areas. And so, you know, this brings us to the most intractable of problems, which is human population. And, you know, this is a very difficult topic to discuss because it creates massive anxieties about the idea of trying to limit human population. And yet, at the same time, by not discussing it, we're condemning future generations to internal conflict over resources and an increasing problem that you mentioned, which is the destruction of habitat. So in a sense, I think we need to have a global conversation about population. But given the inequalities that exist, it is really a very difficult conversation to have. But at some point, we are going to have to face up to that one, and sooner the better, really. Yeah.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk, and I can't wait to read Water Beings. And so my question, I come from literature, and so I want to think more on the side of the imaginary and the imagination. So if you don't mind, I'll make quick references to two recent fictions about Venice that have water beings at their center. One is the second last Spider-Man movie, where the Rialto Bridge over there is destroyed by a gigantic water creature called water elementals. And so I think it's interesting that water beings can be, or are, represented as destructive. And a slightly more highbrow reference, the Amitav Ghosh Amitav Ghosh's novel set in Venice, Gun Island, has this figure, this water monster that is on the other side of the Grand Canal, that is part of the sort of set of non-human characters that inhabit the novel. But my question goes back to your opening remarks. As my brilliant environmental humanities students know, we always also begin with a reference to what you describe as the ontological dualism between nature and culture that exists in the West. But I think there is a side effect to that, and I would like to have your opinion on that, that when we insist on this ontological dualism in the West, and we, of course, also appeal to resources of indigenous cultures to challenge that dualism, I think we may run the risk of forgetting that the West is hardly an undifferentiated bloc. And I think that one important move would be to try to mobilize the cultural resources of minority and subaltern cultures of the West. Whether we can call them indigenous cultures is a different story, but I think it's important that on the one hand, especially students are trained to recognize the hegemonic discourse and the counter discourse coming from indigenous knowledges, but I think it's also important to pay attention to the fact that within what we call the West, there are so many different voices, some of which, of course, has no voice, that have, I think, a more balanced relationship with the non-human part. So that's the...
Yeah, well, thank you, Charles. Those are two really interesting areas. One is the monstrousness of water beings and their capacity to represent chaotic destruction and the power of nature. And there is some lovely anthropology being written in the last decade about monsters themselves. And water beings are very much capable of being monstrous. They're often anthrophagic, you know, they're often big jaws, big teeth. They consume and swallow people. And I was talking to our Samoan friends earlier this morning about the tsunami as being this terribly big consuming thing, a thing that consumes people and order. And in a sense, I think this highlights the need to understand that water beings represent order and disorder. And so when water flows as we need it, as it should, where it should be, it represents an orderly world. And then when it doesn't, the water beings represent that capacity of the world to become chaotic. And this gives us a little bit of insight into why people are so keen to contain and control water, because water infrastructure functions as a way of creating order in the world with our most essential element. And so it gives, why are people so hung up on big dams? Well, because it's all about control and instrumentality, and it gives us an illusion, or perhaps a delusion, that we have control over the world. And when if you listen to the language of floods and droughts, it's all about the chaos and the consuming thing. So water beings personify this magnificently with their great swallowing jaws and capacity to destroy the Rialto Bridge, etc., which sounds very wonderful. But then I think you also make a really important point about diversity in our societies, because we get so used to hearing the same old dominant voices about how the world is supposed to be. And of course, most of us don't really think like that, in fact. And there are so many groups. I mean, I'm just returning to an area in Dorset where I did some research previously, working with pagan groups. Now, interestingly, in the UK, pagan groups are growing, and Christian people, in our censuses, people who define themselves as Christians shrinking, because people want to reconnect with the non-human world. They want religion. They don't necessarily want all the patriarchal stuff that comes with conventional monotheisms. And so pagan groups are growing, while Christian groups are decreasing. And so there are these groups reviving fertility rituals and building dragons and doing art, lots of art groups, all this wonderful stuff, which are articulating exactly the kind of alternative values that are indigenous to the UK, the kind of previous paganism that pertained in sort of Celtic or pre-Christian Roman times is being revived. And so you have all these wonderful well dressings and rituals celebrating sacred water places and so forth, which of course is a way of reconnecting with some very important ideas. about water. In fact, where I was born in Durham, there's a very famous dragon water being from medieval period, and there's a song and a story, and I won't sing it to you, I promise, you're safe. But it's a very interesting story because it is slain by a Christian crusader. And then even now, there's a ceremony when the Bishop of Durham is enthroned that he has to be, there's a ceremony, he has to come into a river, across a bridge, and he's handed a medieval sword, and he has to swear to slay the dragon. Can you imagine? And yet, Justin Welby, who's now the Archbishop of Canterbury, said, we must bring Christianity into every community. We must topple the false idols. So this tension between alternative ideas about the environment and the monotheism is still alive and kicking in the church in Britain. And so you get this very interesting dialogue between pagans and environmentalists, and feminism is sort of tied into this as well, because in a sense it's all about inequality and the dominant religious and scientific voices. So yes, this is a very important point. Thank you, Charles.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I'm just...
A bit abrupt, and then we have to have a few minutes.
Yeah, I was just going to...
Maybe we go, yeah.
I have to bring this fascinating discussion to a close, so we're going to have a short break before resuming at 11:20 with our roundtable, continuing this idea of personhood and water bodies. But before we do that, I'd like to thank again very much Veronica Strang.
Thank you, that was fun.
Sorry to have such a short break. But we are now ready to Talanoa, and of course we are extremely thankful to Professor Strang for a very rich and inspiring talk, really, that has given so much actually to Talanoa about. And thank you to our students, to our speakers, to the people online. I'll very briefly introduce the speakers today. So the idea, of course, is to keep talking about and debating about the idea of personhood and water body. Here at NICHE, we have just started a one-year program of research on water, partly inspired by the water humanities, but perhaps more in general by water studies. That's what we want to try and do. So we want to be interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary. And some of the people here, I think, are very much part of this team that we have here at NICHE, but of course, we want to be also very much in dialogue with other places and other bodies of water, so of course the Pacific first of all in the context of the Talanoa Forum, so Venice and the Global South and Venice as part of the international and planetary dialogue on these topics. So very quickly, I'm Francesca Tarocco, the director of NICHE, the new institute Center for Environmental Humanities here at Ca Foscari University of Venice. And here on my right, we have Lelei Lelaulu, yeah? Garibaldi, exactly, who is chair of the Earth Council. Then we have Silvia Francescon, who hails from the Italian Buddhist Union and has newly been chosen as our new fellow in environmental studies here at Ca Foscari. Then we have Zoi Aliozi. Dr. Aliozi is here in Venice, working in Venice in the Global Campus for Human Rights, and is of course practicing also in terms of consultancy. So it's a mixture really, the panel is a mixture of practitioners, scholars, and people involved in various organizations. So that's what I think makes it kind of interesting. We have Sara, who's a professor. Professor Sara De Vido is a professor here in the Department of Economics, and she is very much involved also with trying to do good stuff, kind of changing the conversation at the national and international level on some of these topics. Pietro Consolandi, Ocean Space, a new initiative, well, not so new, 3 years old, I guess, initiative in Venice that's both an art space and a research platform on oceanic themes. And then we have Professor Warglien, Massimo Warglien, who is on the NICHE board, in fact, and a very active collaborator and co-conspirators for all things NICHE. And he's a professor. He's a social scientist, really, but he's in the department here at Venice, here in the Department of Management. And then we have Alex Sua, who has just agreed to join us, the panel, very happily, from the Fa'afafine Association of Samoa, and a practicing lawyer. And last but not least, Professor Omodeo, who is also very niche and who's also very much involved with studying the Venetian lagoon in terms of cosmotechnics. He's an intellectual historian and philosopher. So, please go ahead. I think we can have a couple of minutes each, but a bit more, 5 or 6 minutes each. And as we were discussing earlier, you know, everyone, I think, can expand on some of these themes of personhood, but also perhaps focus on a keyword. I guess one of the keywords that I had in mind when Professor Strang was talking, and I don't know if this is relevant or resonates to any of you, is this idea of sentience. Right, so the tradition I study, Buddhist traditions, and I was thinking about, for example, Tibetan legal codes who were still active, you know, that were still active in the 20th century. These are some of the earliest legal codes that involved cosmologies. These codes were based around this idea of sentience. So, yeah, please go ahead. Shall I pass the mic around? Do you want to go first?
Do I have a choice? No. First of all, I'd like to recognize Yuki Kihara, because, you know, as a Pacific Islander, seeing what Yuki has done here is just astounding, and also the focus on the Fa'afafine community. The thing is that, you know, it is incomprehensible for me as a Samoan to consider life without Fa'afafine. There's a Fa'afafine in your family, Fa'afafine in the wider family, a Fa'afafine who's a disciplinarian, a Fa'afafine at school, Fa'afafine everywhere. And of course, the American Samoa soccer team, men's soccer team, was led by a Fa'afafine to the World Cup. Very good. But anyway, thank you, Yuki, for doing this, and thank you to all the rest of you who made this possible. It's an historic moment, and we all appreciate it very, very much. And also, I am awed to be in such a fantastic academic company, because I was actually kicked out of anthropology at university for asking too many stupid questions. So my ignorance of all these topics is so great, it basically has to be studied at some point in time. But just, you know, it also is wonderful to have the tour with the Peggy Guggenheim Museum yesterday. It reminds me of the importance of recognizing the fact that art, what we recognize as art, is also, we're curating basically the tastes of elites from hundreds of years, if you think about it. And so Peggy Guggenheim did great things, but, you know, it was all about Peggy as well. I remember Peggy was interviewed by somebody that said, "Peggy, how many husbands have you had?" And she said, "Mine or others?" So, you know, it's a life well lived. It's wonderful. You know, Venice is lucky to have her works here and her tastes here, which is very, very good. And then also, you look at Venice, right? You know, as I said, you know, I'm an ignoramus. I know nothing about all this sort of thing. But essentially, Venice is like a Pacific Islander, because we Pacific Islanders, what we did, the ocean was very much part of us. There was no separation. The ocean protected us. The ocean succored us. The ocean gave us food. And it's protected us from nasty things. And if you think about it, Venice, how did Venice start? Venice, there was a whole bunch of people from the mainland who were afraid of all the wars, internecine wars that were going on in Italy. So what did they do? They looked at what these people fighting, what did they really want? They wanted big castles, strong lands, mountains and things, which could easily be protected, so they could protect the resources from those who would take it away. And what did the Venetians do? They went to a swamp. Who wants to invade a swamp, for goodness sake? They built Venice, and then what did they do? They controlled many things. They controlled the cash. They looked outwards. They brought goods and services in from other parts of the known world. They controlled the trade, in other words. They brought the trade in, and then they used diplomacy to protect themselves right around the known world. So this is brilliant. So this is what Venice is. But then you look at it today, with also the cash. We in the Pacific Islands, a lot of us make money from from offshore banking facilities, which of course are now very bad, because the rich people decide that it's okay to be bad, to be attacked for having offshore banking facilities. But it's the cash that we need to help us build our societies. The other way we get cash is through tourism. And I know tourism is very, very, it's very controversial, but, but look at Venice, right? What is Venice? What are the cultural aspects of Venice? Is Venice a fantasy? Are we here because Lord Byron liked it? Are we here because Daphne du Maurier wrote a couple of very good phrases about it? Where is it? For me, 80% of my time, my waking time in Venice, is looking for the station for the Vaporetti, sitting on the Vaporetti, getting off the Vaporetti, finding the way to somewhere else in Venice after Vaporetti. So for me, the cultural thing that I remember of Venice is the Vaporetti and how to find it, right? But anyway, I'm just saying that tourism also offers cultural heritage a means of getting enhancing and ensuring its longevity, as we discussed yesterday. Tourism is what makes Venice. Tourism was the selling of the fantasy of Venice. Likewise, Pacific Islands are kept alive by the fantasies of small island states: sea, sand, sex, and nothing else. But so if we look again at how we are going to convey the importance of our cultures overseas, we have to look at the tourism industry, because they have the strongest external communication systems in most parts of the world. Find ways to link into that and ensure that our cultural assets and what we consider important are on there somewhere. Anyway, that's the sort of a side thing. I'll just talk a quick mention about personhood and oceans. I'm part of an initiative also set up by Yuki, whereby we're looking at framing and drafting a universal declaration of rights for oceans. Now, our professor has many things to say about that, but you have to remember that in the United States of America, the Supreme Court has determined that corporations are persons. So a seabed mining company has rights, whereas the ocean does not have rights. So this is the illogicality of it. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to ensure that the ocean has people speaking for it. Now, already it's being done in Aotearoa, New Zealand. The Whanganui River has been declared a person. The Urewera forest areas have been declared persons. And if you think it's stupid, I have to remind you that Colombia, Panama has just done it. These countries have declared nature, and Ecuador, they've declared nature as personhood. I'm just reminding him, because students always forget things very quickly. So this is, it's starting to happen. The movement is starting to happen. Even without a universal declaration, things will happen because it becomes a movement. In Belize, in Mesoamerica, for example, a tanker hit the reef, which is one of the most important reefs in the world. So the local communities, they sued the oil company. They won, they got money. The Supreme Court of Belize said, no. The amount of money that the court gave was insufficient to cover the loss, the spiritual loss, the cultural loss, and the importance of this reef to the indigenous people. So the Supreme Court upped the amount of money that the oil company had to give. So this is beginning to happen. And we're hopeful that by working with other parts of the world, we can do something. But we wanted to concentrate first, after the Talanoa that Yuki set up, to look at the personhood of the Pacific Ocean as a start. Because we're there, it's easy for us to control, and then we'll move it outwards from there. But again, it's a movement. And once people see that it's a movement, people will stop doing negative things to it. If you look at a dog and you know a dog has rights, you're not going to kick it. Perhaps pinch it, but not kick it. So that's what we're trying to do. Get this movement going, get people understand that the ocean, which provides food for most of the world, it sequesters 50% of the carbon in the world. It has to have rights, and it has to recognize that the indigenous people who are stewards of the ocean also have to have a voice in determining what those rights are.
Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you so much. Yes, the point is well taken.
Thank you, Francesca. It's a privilege to be here. And I would like to start by saying something that I define my turning point in approaching environmental law. I have a background of environmental law, and then perhaps in the little time that we have, provide some keywords rather than like a fully fledged speech. As I said, I was coming from an environmental law background in the traditional way, which I think is very much based on anthropocentrism. And one day I was negotiating, it was like more than 20 years ago, I was negotiating for Italy a topic which is a part of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and is the access and benefit sharing of genetic resources. And there is another part of that convention which relates, it's the Article 8J, to the traditional indigenous knowledge. So basically what happens in the world is that companies, mostly companies, but also states, go where in those countries which are rich of genetic resources. They take the genetic resources, they patent them, and they make a profit out of it. And the same goes with the traditional knowledge, how you use those resources, those genetic resources, and the method and the qualities and the properties of those genetic resources in terms of medicine, for example, but also the cosmetic and beauty sector, etc., etc. You want to make money out of it, and you want to patent both the resources and the knowledge. And we were negotiating, and we as EU were thinking to be the good guys. We were outraged by the fact that many companies, especially in the US, which by the way has signed but not ratified that convention, which makes it very powerful in being there without taking commitments. We were thinking of being the good guys by saying, okay, you know what we do? We make a database of genetic resources and as well as of traditional knowledges, so that every time something like that happens, we share the benefits, meaning money, so-called capacity building, whatever activities, etc., etc. And the indigenous communities were there, of course, not in terms of negotiating, because the conferences of the parties are for the parties, for governments and states. They told us, we don't care about your money. Those genetic resources and those traditional knowledge are not for the money. They have a spiritual value for us. So we don't care to make profit out of it. And for me, that was truly a shift in perception completely. And I go back to what I was saying before. Environmental law, the way I studied it, is completely anthropocentric. So everything we have heard from Professor Strang and also just now, the recognition of the rights of nature and the personhood, especially, it all started with rivers, by the way. We have many, many cases of rivers and also non-human animals, and as well as Mother Nature in general, but mostly on rivers. I do think will help us in moving toward a different approach from anthropocentrism to ecocentrism. and avoiding that sense of separation and duality that was also recalled before. What we can call eventually earth law system, which is much more than a pure legalistic approach made out of legislation and rulings by courts in the world. So I think that, and I was also very much interested in here Professor Strang when she said that could be tricky to move from a pure legalistic, if I understood correctly, and there may be some concern about the secular dimension that and including also religious beliefs. At the same time, I sense that there is a need for a new theory, a need to have a basis for this incredible movement that is taking off. And because we have these patchwork situations where we do have rights of natures recognized here and there, and we have already all the cases mentioned, the Wanganui River, but also Belize, but also in Canada, but also in India, even though there is a little bit more fragile with the Ganga, for example, and the glaciers, etc., we have so many cases. But I do think for the movement, I sense this necessity to find a common theory which is at the basis of, which creates the basis for the recognitions of these rights. And this, and also to move from the pure legalistic approach, I would also, and it was mentioned before as well, is not just the law, is the decision-making process, which is extremely important in all this. Climate justice, in my view, is not just the topic of loss and damage, as we know it from the climate negotiations, whereby, of course, those countries who have polluted less are affected the most by the consequences of climate change. But if we want to have a truly rule-based system, again, we should move from a westernized approach of the legal dimension and embrace the informal legal system that is very much present in some communities. It doesn't make much sense to have a regulation that, by the way, is not enforced. And many systems, because we should decolonize, I think, our thought, and many systems rely on trust of the community judges, for example, and therefore perhaps also move from the idea that the legal system is something the way we have always conceived it. But I would love also to hear from Zoi and from Sara in this respect. From a Buddhist perspective, of course, this is also relevant, whereby Buddhism is based on the principle of interdependence, which is a word that we keep on hearing, but what does interdependence mean in concrete terms? Is the non-separation, the non-duality, and I really like the idea of moving towards a UN declaration that is not divided between human beings and non-human beings, and we should perhaps make it whole, as you said before, Professor. And a master teacher like Thich Nhat Hanh used to call this interdependence as interbeings. And when we practice, like breathing, etc., every time we breathe is not just a concentration on our breath, but my breath is your breath, is the same air. We are breathing the same air. So I do believe that Buddhism has so much in common with the indigenous community, spiritual essence. I was about to say approach. It's not an approach, it's the essence. And I would like to finish with the words of a Thai Buddhist master. The entire cosmos is cooperative. The sun, the moon, and the stars live together as cooperative. The same is true for humans and animals, trees, and the earth. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Zoi. I am teaching human rights and climate justice in the Global Campus of Human Rights. So what I'm trying to do is, after almost 2 decades of climate activism, to educate the new generations to actually, you know, to see if it's possible to actually see some real progress in the field. Because in reality, we are seeing more talks than actions in the climate justice field. So if you're familiar with the term climate action, that the states are obliged and have duty to actually take. So this is what we're trying to do. I'm a climate justice expert, let's say, and an educator. So before I start, I want to say I really enjoyed your talk, and thank you very much, everybody's contributions. But it inspired me to actually mention that I come from Greece, from a place that we have a river passing through my city. It's called Ceres. An ancient god is supposed to, you know, be the protector of the river. So even in my culture, rivers, natural lakes, natural places are important, and they have even the importance, the value of a deity, of a god, of something divine, in order to protect them and respect them. I don't know what happened the last 2,000 years, and yeah. Okay, so I just realized that, you know, even in where I come from, we have a river with a god protecting it, and, you know, sometimes we don't appreciate the cultural background. So let me just maybe say what climate justice can bring into a conversation about personhood, about protecting the oceans, about water. So climate justice is looking mainly on the phenomenon of climate change. So natural disasters, natural environmental harms, that they are anthropogenic. So humans are actually destroying our environment, and this is what we are looking at. We're not looking at any kind of environmental harm. So we care about that. Why? Because we want to see who is responsible for that. We can rely on political promises or on the goodwill of people to respect the environment. We want laws that will basically protect really our nature, our natural home, right? And this is what climate justice is trying to bring into the table. It's trying to combine an understanding of the environment from a philosophical, a legal, a political, an ethical perspective. So it's as if we're wearing some climate justice glasses and suddenly we see all this phenomenon from an ethical perspective. So it's basically expanding our understanding of what law should protect and what is the reach of, let's say, law. But in that sense, it is important to also appreciate the power that human rights can bring into this field. Because human rights, although anthropocentric to a great extent, however, they have like this already existing infrastructure, all the tools, all the know-how that we can use to also protect the environment, protect nature. Now, there are a lot of problems, as previous speakers said, about can we actually look at nature as a person, as someone that can have rights? Can they actually appear in a court? Very simply put. So there are ways to overcome these obstacles. And one way to overcome this obstacle is to expose the outdated philosophy of anthropocentrism, because from a climate justice perspective, it's outdated. It doesn't work. It doesn't even make sense anymore in a world like the one we're living in. So we see hope in introducing an ecocentric approach. So instead of having laws that see value only on the humans, the anthropocentric philosophy sees that if there is intrinsic value for the human beings, then it's a good law. No, ecocentric actually says that every living being, any environment, our whole nature should be protected, has value, has intrinsic value, and has a right to exist and flourish. Not just if there is value for the human beings. So there is this conflict between anthropocentrism and ecocentrism in the legal perspective, right? I'm trying to contribute from a legal perspective and philosophical. Because as many of you will know, climate activism does work. There is an amazing climate justice movement, but we also need laws with teeth, like we say. Something that will actually bring results. So this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to introduce, for example, the ideas of green crimes in the international legal world. Yes, green crimes is, like we say, we're trying to put some color in international law, but from an environmental perspective. Like we're talking about the rights of nature, right? We're talking about green crimes like ecocide, if you're familiar. I want to talk just 1 minute about ecocide because it's part of my current research, and I was amazed to realize that etymologically, as a word, as a term, it's a synthetic word, ecocide. Eco, in ancient Greek, means home, where we live. Eco comes from, so my home. Side means to kill, to destroy. So basically, this international proposed crime, green crime, means to kill my home. So to kill, yes, where we live. It's a very progressive, concept, and there is a lot of hope that it will actually be included in the jurisdiction, like we say, of the International Criminal Court. This is the biggest, let's say, the most powerful international criminal court, and we are all, like, as scholars, as activists, we're trying to promote these ideas and push for real change in the legal infrastructure as well. So thank you very much. Sara will continue.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much to the organizers of this amazing conference for the invitation. And yeah, I actually will continue what you have previously said, because I'm an international lawyer and I've been working on women's rights for some years now, and also ecocentric approaches to international law. And I was really fascinated and encouraged by listening to these new, refreshing approaches from different perspectives. Because as lawyers, especially Italian legal scholarship, we tend to be quite conservative in our mindset. So it was great to listen to Professor Strang about personhood and rivers and other natural elements rights. So what I would like to propose to you today, very briefly, is to reflect on possibility of cross-fertilization among regional human and no human, hopefully, rights courts, looking at the European Court of Human Rights in particular. So the rights of nature debate, as strong as Zoi has said, legal and philosophical aspect, which is highlighted by this idea of shift in the idea and the attitude towards nature from the anthropocentric approach to an ecocentric one. And I realized the same as Silvia, that environmental law, international environmental law, as we teach it, is anthropocentric. And also we tend to also split
what is environmental law to what is human rights law, and thanks to also the resolutions, Professor Strang mentioned the Human Rights Council resolution, we tend to combine environment and human rights, which is a first step, but not enough. We need to overcome this one as well. So ecocentrism, as I mean it in international law, means to consider humanity as part of a whole, as of course indigenous communities teach us. And from a legal perspective is the us that actually a famous lawyer, American lawyer in the 70s theorized, Christopher Stone, in the landmark paper, Should Trees Have Standing? So it means to consider the protection of the environment in a way that conceives nature not as an object subjugated to humans, or better, a part of humanity actually, but as a holistic system of which every living being is part. And patterns of oppression and domination are so not only intraspecies, indeed, but also interspecies in the relation between humans and nature. And this human and nature dichotomy that has already been mentioned has been used to determine these patterns of oppression and discrimination. And what we see today, ecological disaster, but also the pandemic that we have seen, are actually the tip of the iceberg of a long process of destruction that a scholar defined as low violence, and I'm trying to legally conceptualize it, because I found that this low violence, this gradual violence that occurs through climate change, through the erosion, through the loss of biodiversity and habitats, describes perfectly this idea. And also, the concepts we use in international law embrace concepts of power and domination. And there are some changes at UN level. It's true, I totally agree with Professor Strang. There are some changes, especially by the Special Rapporteur on the Rights to Healthy Environment, David Boy, that said that today's dominant culture and the legal system that supports it are self-destructive. And he encouraged a new approach rooted in ecology and ethics. We are part of nature, not independent, but interdependent. And ecofeminism, that has never been really approached from a legal perspective, has played a pivotal role in denouncing those patterns of oppression within human and of a part of humanity on nature. So what I started to look from a legal perspective is to change and to propose a paradigmatic shift in international law, not only international environmental law, but international law in general. And the debate is dramatically real these days while talking, for example, about the use of nuclear weapons. Because if we take an ecocentric approach to that, we see that we cannot accept like the use of low potential weapons from an ecocentric point of view. But let's look at the courts. So the Inter-American Court of Human Rights has taken quite an innovative approach through an advisory opinion in 2017 and a contentious case in 2020, deriving an autonomous right to a healthy environment, not human, but a general right to a healthy environment from one article of the American Convention of Human Rights, which was conceived as an anthropocentric instrument. But the Inter-American Court of Human Rights went a bit further. And this is an unprecedented move in regional jurisprudence, also in terms of jurisdiction. I won't go into those details, but we need to face those legal constraints because that is what states counter-argue during negotiation. They say, oh, but we have the legal constraints, how to overcome them with new laws. But new laws in international law means that we need to have states to agree on that. So that's the big issue. So what about the European Court of Human Rights? Well, as the former president of the court, Robert Spano, now we have the first female president of the European Court of Human Rights, but the former president said in a thought-provoking interview, he said, yes, the European Convention of Human Rights is really purely anthropocentric, being conceived and applied this way. So we do have jurisprudence at the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg related to the environment. But the process was to indirectly basically protecting the environment because only when there is a human right effective, then we protect the environment. So it is indirect. And the answer also from the pure legal, you said legalistic, right? So the pure legal scholars is that, well, we have legal constraints. We have the definition of victim. We have jurisdiction. I won't go into detail because it's crazy. But so what we need now, well, actually, there are some possibilities. And also what former President Spano said is that European Court of Human Rights that has showed an evolutive interpretation in many cases has to take up the challenge. And to do that, what is encouraging would be this idea of cross-fertilization through jurisprudence between, for example, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights jurisprudence and the European one. We have 2 pending cases which might end very badly, like in a very poor way, or might determine a change. And there are 2 climate change cases. One, the Portuguese youth case against 33 states of the Council of Europe, and the Senior Women for Climate Protection against Switzerland. Those cases are so important that they were relinquished, which means that they were given to the Grand Chamber, so decided by 17 judges, so quite powerful. So to conclude, what I can see here, apart from looking at international law in a very critical way and looking at possibility of changing paradigm and shifting to ecocentrism, is also to encourage this idea of cross-fertilization, which might be extremely powerful in terms of interpretation of what we have already. Then obviously new laws are absolutely welcome. There is a proposal for a protocol to the European Convention on Human Rights on the right to healthy environment, where there are some ecocentric seeds in the legal text. But obviously we need the agreement of states to adopt this additional protocol. So what I'm encouraging is a more ecocentric interpretation of existing legal instruments. Thank you.
Well, thank you, everyone. I'm Pietro Consolandi, and I'm a researcher for TBA 21 Academy. That is the foundation that runs Ocean Space here in Venice. So my point, both as an individual and as an institution member, is builds on the rights of nature principle that we heard a lot about today, especially from indigenous cultures, like the Wanganui River and the Teurewera forest in New Zealand, or the concept of Pachamama in Ecuador. But what about the West? And I agree with Shaul while saying that the West is not undifferentiated. But my starting quote is by one of the most Western institutions you can think of, which is the Supreme Court of the United States of A. That is the same body that gave to corporations personhood, so giving personhood to a bureaucratic existence, while not granting personhood to ecosystems. But that's hardly unchallenged from the very beginning of this conception. And because, for example, William Douglas, who was a member of the Supreme Court in 1965, he called for a Bill of Rights for rivers, forests, mountains, and ecosystems. And he said, and for those who find life in a mechanized society unbearable without the delight and the joy that nature brings to us. So a very strong conception of the natural love that humans feel for their ecosystems as something that has high value. And this was almost 50 years ago, and we see how the law is changing very slowly. But in the meantime, as the law is changing very slowly, the ecosystems and the world around us is changing very, very fast. And for example, TBA 21 Academy is working closely with a number of case studies, of which I want to willingly quote just 2 in Europe. And the first one is the Marmara Sea. The Marmara Sea is an inland sea in Turkey on which Istanbul is built, largely for its contiguity with the Bosphorus, which was which provided a lot of fish to people there. So, relying on the ecosystem for human survival. But the Marmara Sea is nowadays very dead. In 1915, an Armenian man who was the director of the Istanbul fish market made a fantastic research showing how there were 147 relevant fish species, which is very anthropocentric, but it was 1915 after all. But now there's less than 20. So more than 120 disappeared in the space of a century. Especially the bluefin tuna, very charismatic and very delicious for those of us who eat fish species, that in 1982, the whole school of migrating tuna through the Bosphorus was fished in one go. And after that, tuna decided never to go back to Istanbul because it's not nice. But nowadays, the vast majority of people living in Istanbul find sci-fi, the idea of having tuna passing through there. And only 40 years have passed. So we see how the perception of the ecosystem shifted radically after a very fast event, clashing with the concept of slow violence, which is more to be seen on a global level. So this has been defined by many scholars as the shifting baseline syndrome. So the fact that people who are new in an ecosystem take the current state of it as granted. And it can be seen as a late stage of eco-depression. So seeing how an ecosystem cannot be changed and its devastated status, it is what it is. And that facilitates policies of further environmental devastation. Another case of it, with which we work very closely, is the Mar Menor in Murcia, that some of us might have heard, was the first ecosystem in Europe to be granted, I mean, it's still under discussion, but the parliament approved it, to be granted rights of nature and legal protection and legal personhood. This happened in a very, very fast span of time because the people in Murcia, also facilitated by the Universidad de Murcia, managed to gather more than 600,000 signatures in just 3 years for this to be discussed by the parliament. This happened after the sea turned into the so-called sopa verde, which means the green soup, which, you know, it's not so nice to think about. It's very much similar to the Venetian lagoon. It's a large saltwater lagoon that was destroyed by decades of especially untreated discharge from agriculture and urban development. But one curious thing about the Mar Menor case is the vast majority of the activists are elderly people, like 70 plus. Most of them are retired. This is not only because they are retired so they have more time, but speaking with them, many of them quote the fact that younger generations are already accustomed to the Mar Menor being almost dead. So this seems to be a case in which this shifting baseline syndrome influenced vastly younger generations, besides the material constraints that most people there have to work every day, all day. But something that challenged action, this state of depression, that cut what William Douglas was speaking about, like, you know, finding life unbearable, but it is bearable because there's this nature around us. So if that is devastated, what remains to us? And this is very much the approach that a Western way to adapt the rights of nature, despite our Christian, capitalist, Western, undifferentiated again, but for the sake of brevity, culture. How to build that again is very much to be discussed, and how to build a movement that can push for a more suitable and more efficient biocentric policy to be adopted. Can be also place-based education, and this is something that at TBA and Ocean Space we try to develop very much, but also with an artist group called Barena Bianca, which is mostly does workshop with local kids, and I was very surprised by seeing that a lot of 17, 8 years old Venetian children don't really know what a salt marsh is, while it's the main ecosystem protecting the Lagoon of Venice. So explaining to someone the importance of the lagoon in a classroom rather than encouraging them to dive their hand in the mud, to taste local flora, and to have like a fish jumping on your kayak is very different when you try to build such sentimental connection and a real kind of embodied knowledge that highlights how much we are all part of nature. And another case that I just wanted to mention briefly is the involvement in the deep sea in the fight to develop deep sea mining or to fight against deep sea mining. Because our foundation, TBA 21 Academy, has the luck to be a observing member of the International Seabed Authority, which is a UN body that regulates deep sea mining, especially beyond national jurisdiction, despite that being declared common heritage of mankind. So what happens when we try to shift the common heritage of mankind to a common heritage of all kind is that we see that without the scientific evidence that deep sea mining will not destroy the seabed, that is an environment that we hardly know still to this day. We know much more about the surface of the moon and Mars rather than the deep seabed. How can we think to drill through that? As Professor Strang was saying, it means literally driving a hole in all of us, if it's the common heritage of mankind, or in the world itself, if it's of all kind. So this is why TBA, despite being a broadly Western foundation, of course, being literally based in Austria, tries to work as much as possible with Pacific communities to support their claim to be stewards of their ecosystem and for a moratorium on deep sea mining. So we can see how the local and the planetary are inextricably entangled, even though forms of governance and lawmaking not always are. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you. And Massimo Warglien. I'm a social scientist with a background in economics mostly, so neither an anthropologist nor a legal student, so I apologize for the amateurish nature of many of my remarks. We have been talking about rights to water and rights of water. They are obviously related, but I think they are pretty different things at the same time, and I will focus very much on this idea of rights of water. And there, of course, this notion of legal personhood is a key word that resonates all the time, and I would just like to introduce a few cautions about using it, based, as I was invited to talk about a case study, based on simple observation on a case study, where I think important aspects of the different ways in which water manifests itself come and suggest that the notion of a water body is just one way to think about. Presented as a body, and where the very it doesn't work? I should eat it. Okay. Okay, sorry. So the little story I want to talk about is based on observation which are still ongoing in an area of the northeast of India, the Khasi Hills, which is entirely shaped by water, both physically and socially and culturally, and in particular shaped by monsoons. It's actually the most rainy probably area of the world, and there monsoons have been not only carving literally the hills, but creating a huge difference in the landscape and in society. If you just cross the hills, the side which is exposed to monsoons is fundamentally still now based on hunting and gathering as a social and economic activity. You just go to the area protected from monsoons, what you find is agriculture. So a big divide of human history is just represented there by the action of water as weather, as monsoons. And what is very interesting is that if you look at how people there, the local culture thinks and acts about water, you find some very common traits, I think, we have been talking about also today, that might be shared by, let me be a little bit rough about it, or by animistic cultures. So the personification or the personhood attribution to natural entity is very strong and is related, of course, also to water. For example, rivers are sacred entities, although it's ambiguous whether really it's the river or sometimes the deities they host. And these are, of course, again, slightly different things, and there are many variations about it. People have a sort of social relationship with water, in particular with rivers. So there's a sense of reciprocity, there's a sense that you can act, but you can also have to respect reciprocal rules, both by, for example, the violation of such rules can imply punishment from the rivers. If people are drowning in rivers, usually people think it's because they made something wrong to the river. There's actually a beautiful symmetric formula that they sometimes refer to by saying, just like our bodies can drink the water of the river can drink our bodies, and that's what is drowning. I think it's a nice way to represent really this sort of symmetric idea of how we relate to each other. Actually, water, in particular rivers, have even a recognized legal role. For example, they have beautiful root bridges over the rivers, which are created just to respond actually to the peculiar nature of monsoons. And if you ask who's the owner of the bridge, they will tell you there are three owners of the bridge. On one bank of the river is the clan owning typically the terrains on that bank. On the other is the other clan that owns the other part, but the center of the bridge is owned by the river. So there are these typically strong attribution of personhood. But if you look a little bit closer to it, you find a lot of interesting exceptions, and you start feeling a little bit more uncertain about this strong notion of personhood is attributed to rivers. For example, well, of course, the very notion of personhood, you know, it's very anthropomorphic, but this is no problem. Many animistic cultures are anthropomorphic. But it really requires a body. That's an important point. So it applies well, apparently, to water bodies, much less well to what is not representable as a body. So it applies well to a lake, but very hard to apply to rain or to any kind of natural cycle that affects deeply also the natures of water bodies. And water as an event, water falling or whatever, really escapes, I think, personification or these personhood attributions. But it's really the real thing, because monsoons are events, are not things, and they are really what shapes life there. Second, I think this attribution of personhood, even to rivers, is neither universal nor stable. First of all, it doesn't apply to all rivers and to all traits of a river. It's specific traits, usually the sources, and so on. And also it's very pragmatic in a sense, because attribution of personhood is not general to other natural entities. It is very selective, only in some cases, and sometimes it's not really referring to the entity, but even to the use of the entity. So, for example, there are deities which refer only to the drinking and cooking water, right, which is clearly not an element, is a usage we make of it, which is represented by the Ulei Umtang, which is a kind of deity here. And finally, even the legal framework that they apply, who's the owner of the bridge, is very ambiguous, because if you dive a little bit into it, you discover that the very notion of ownership has been brought into these cultures by colonialism. It's not a native notion, right? It was a clan type of societies where there was no clear notion of ownership, as we might say. So when you ask, actually, who's the owner, or when they tell you who's the owner of the central part of the bridge, well, really what is happening is probably that they are forcing a different perception of things into our legal framework. So my impression, to finish this little postcard from the Khasi Hills of Meghalaya, is I think that as you dive a little bit into the nature of an element like water, its personhood dissolves very quickly. And we have to be a little bit careful, because if we impose on it our legal framework of the personhood notion, we bias a lot the way we perceive water. And we might create a way to interpret, understand, provide meaning to water, which is actually, well, biased is the minimum, might really hide to us important aspects of what it means to interact with it. So I think that exporting our legal framework, our legal ontology on these kind of entities is a little bit slippery and dangerous, and we might be very careful in using it to understand and to think about legal solutions. Maybe we need a different legal ontology to deal with this. Okay, thank you.
Talo falava mo mona
Whaaftai I le uso whawhawhina matua ia yuki o no le hawa no tu ina mai nei whapea fo ia lelei. Now, my name is Alex Sua. I'm based in Samoa. I'm a lawyer by profession. And I will speak about, very briefly, the traditional and cultural knowledge that we have of non-human beings and the boundaries that are often drawn because of that understanding towards the relations of our Samoan people towards non-human beings. I can speak in my village. There's a neighboring village which I am also connected to in Samoa. It's called Amaile. I remember in my young days, we would used to go because it's quite cliffy towards the end of that neighboring village. We would used to go there and we would make jokes out of, we want to see the shark and the turtle. Now, legend has it that the shark and the turtle in this village were actually a mother and a child. They were running, they were looking for food. It was during famine. And so they decided to turn to the gods of the village at that time. They rather pass away into the hands of the gods rather than dying from hunger. So they called out to the gods, and after that they jumped into from the cliff into a very bluish, greenish part of the ocean. And they turned into a turtle and a shark. So there is a song to it. Wherever in fact, I've witnessed when we go and sing to the turtle and the shark. I will sing it later at the end of what I'm sharing. And then you will see a shark and a turtle encircling the area. So we have been told, don't point your finger to the shark or say, lale, lale, lale. We can't, otherwise they'll just dive back into the ocean and disappear. So you'll just encircle around and they'll just eventually disappear and we just walk away. The same thing, we have the same traditional knowledge of when our women go fishing for octopus and collecting seashells. So, because this is often the role of women at the fishing and usually done at the lagoon. So whenever you turn a coral and you find 2 pairs of octopus, it is taboo for you to take 1 or even take 2. The same with eels. You can't take both, remove 1 or remove both, because there is a presumption they are lovers. And you know what happens when one has to remove the other. The other will be heartbroken. So, and this usually would anger or provoke the deities of the sea. And usually problems would happen to the fisherwoman or the family of the fisherwoman. So this same knowledge is also applied to when the high chief of a village dies. It is usually echoed out in the village as a bylaw, as a traditional bylaw in the village. It is now taboo for anyone to go swim in the sea or fish in the sea. It is now taboo for anyone to go cut down a tree at the forest. It is now taboo for anyone to make a noise at the village. And this is because the rationale, or my humble understanding of the traditional knowledge behind that, is because the environment and the non-human beings are mourning too. So we call it wasa le fanua, wasa na pause la au, wasa le sami, wasa le pisa. I'm saying it while I'm feeling goosebumps because I think I'm invoking the non-human beings of my culture. Now, the question is, do we have those in our laws? The quick response to that is no, we don't have that. However, and this is where I come in as a lawyer, to offer a critique of the circumstances and the current framework we have so far back in Samoa. In Samoa, our constitution, which is the mother law of the country, actually states that any land that is below the high water mark is that of the state, including the coastal areas in the villages. So this is all regulated, and of which power is given to the government to regulate. And that is where, and often, the village or the traditional authorities come into clash with the government. Now, the issue with that is that it is always a challenge for government agencies to see to the enforcement of that law and the monitoring, regulatory implementation of that law. We also have a Planning Urban Management Agency Act. This is an act that oversees the implementation of boundaries, of planning, but the challenge to, or the issue with that law is that it is only ineffective and only applies to the areas in the urban side of Apia. It does not apply into the rural villages. Now, we also have our Village Phono Act. This is a very Samoanized legislation which empowers the village or the traditional authorities in the rural areas to see to creating bylaws themselves that see the regulating and the management of their own affairs, including that of these rivers and so on. The problem with that is that if I come in as I'm Italian from Venice, and I would come in and exploit a particular stream of our village, the village law can't be enforced against this person. It is only enforced against the villager from the village. It is also can't be enforced against a neighboring villager. So that's another problem. The other problem with the implementation of that Village Phono Act is it is usually perceived from the point of view of the village phono or the traditional authority. Now, these traditional authorities in the village, and please try and understand this from a developing nation's perspective, you will come across competing interests of we've just felt economic empowerment. We've just felt international law on human rights. It is quite unfair for the international organizations to expect our countries to immediately comply with these laws because the ripple effects are slowly felt. So coming back to the village council, they are and have always been corruptible. If you compare someone, a beautiful person like that of Veronica, to speak about human beings, and if someone else from a multi-million corporate to speak to the village council, they'd rather see money. Why? Because it's a prioritized competing interest. And this is the beauty of this discussion, because I see a lot of these viewpoints are always from the developed nation's perspective. It is somehow leaving behind the developing nation's perspective. How can we harmonize the issues of our economic growth, our adaptation to climate change, and the non-human beings issues? It's something that we still need to work on as in balancing. And in saying that, to probably move forward would be, we can't compare grapes to mangoes or papayas. Seeing to it that we continue to harmonize these issues. And I also encourage that you also try and see these things from the developing nation's perspective. It will be much appreciated. Now, with the application of international law, be that as it may, it is somehow inapplicable in our situations. And even if that is applicable we will have to ensure it is rightly fitted in the circumstances that is acceptable and a lot more receptive to our people, our culture, and our current circumstances. Now, I'll just finish with singing the song about the turtle and the shark. Lau mei fayanga faasua siau tama ai se lau ti la lele lava lava le lau mei lau mei. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And it's so difficult to speak now. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you. I'm a cultural historian of science. So while I was listening to you, I was thinking, what is the relevance of history, which I'd like to defend for the eco-political issues that we are addressing. So I'll first point to history as a repository of ideas, and I'll bring you 3 ideas through images of the water body that I've been studying most, which is the body of the lagoon of Venice, and then make some reflections connected to what we heard. Could you try to show my 3 images? 3 images from Venice in the Renaissance to point to 3 ideas. The lagoon as a... You need to find the folder. Yeah. Here's the wrong one. This one. So it's images from the Renaissance to point to 3... come on. 3 ideas. Water as a living body. Water as a common, and water cosmologies, so concepts that we've been dealing with. So this is a representation of the canals of the lagoon by one of the most prominent engineers, water engineers from the Renaissance, Sabadino. It represents the lagoon in the 16th century. It looks like a lung, and it's not just an analogy. Those days, it was really believed that the lagoon is a living body. So I could go on with this, but there is an idea that there is an interdependency, an organic interdependency between humans and their environment, and the environment itself is an organic body. So we find these sort of ideas from the past, so adding to the cross-cultural dimension that has been presented and defended so much, I'd like also to look at the diachronic dimension, to point later to path dependencies as something very important we have to think about. So the living lagoon, that means if we intervened, or if we intervene in the living body of the lagoon, it is like intervening in a living body, like a physician. So one cannot just fix something in a point without considering the rest. So there is a whole to be taken into account. This is rooted in those days' conceptions, including of medicine. So the second point, water as a common. The waters of the lagoon were public, and they were considered to be common. We can reconstruct it in many ways. I think the most relevant one, or the very significant one, is to look at archival documents concerning the fisherman community, and to look at a society which in the past addressed the fisherman community to assess the interventions that had to be done in the lagoon and the consequences of it. So think of communities, the communal good, which is the waters meaning not just the materiality of water, but also the fish swimming in it, that had to be preserved in the interest of the whole community. Is it a case of circular economy? Yes and no. In part, yes, so we can find examples of communal uses of resources and regulations for it. On the other hand, I'm not sure, so it's really a question, whether also past societies which were circular in a way also delegated or externalized the ecological costs elsewhere. So given the fact that Venice was a center in an economic sense, it might have been a center also in ecology in an ecological sense. It's an open question to historians that relates to today's concerns about ecological justice and balances. And third, water cosmology. Literally, this is an image of sea tides. So we're swimming with the tide. So how are we going to swim with tides? It was one of the main concerns of water engineers and scholars in Venice. This is a representation of the action of cosmic forces, especially the moon and the sun. Maybe you can detect them on worldly waters. So it's a very local manuscript, 16th century. I think the great idea here is that even a local phenomenon is rooted in a cosmological context, really materially, not only mentally, materially connected to the whole of the Earth and the cosmos. So waters, flowing waters are global, are planetary, are cosmic. This is the third idea that I'd like to bring to you today. So my reflections. So we have to do with societies that are engaged with the problem of balances. The eco-political issue is an issue of reconstructing balances. We've been talking about the mental problem, the philosophical problem of the dichotomies, so the separation of the human and the natural realm, which is, of course, an important issue. I think there is a stratigraphy of the problem of what we could call the Anthropocene. A stratigraphy in the sense that we have philosophies, perceptions, psychologies, mentalities, but if we go and see at the different levels, we find the technology, of course, technological transformations of our world, so technology is one of the main issues, but the economic structures too. So we have also to deal with the interconnections of all these dimensions. Because I would say that the rift between the societal and the environmental is a mental rift, which is an ontological one at the same time. So there is really a decoupling of societal processes from their organic connection with the environment. And this disruption needs to be addressed conceptually, philosophically, mentally, as well as materially. And by materially, I think in economic terms, in societal terms. So what we can learn from history is that the historical dimension first points to path dependencies. We are here because we are the resultant of past decisions, path patterns, path processes with a lot of agency. But we also need to open to the future. So to open the future, not to be open, to open a new future as those who can shape and act to have a different eco-sustainable future. And that leads to one paradox, and that's my final point. I would say that that's the eco-political paradox. So from ecocentrism, we learn that society is nature. On the other hand, we learn from history that we need to denaturalize the societal formations we're in. So we are caught in between this tension. We need to decentralize the human. On the other hand, we have to understand the historical constructive element of our present societies. We can name it capitalism. We can call it Western societal formations. We need to have a denaturalizing perspective too. So how are we doing that? That's my open question to us.
Thank you. There's so much going on in this room, right? And I think the panel also was very good at sort of taking up some of the questions I had put to them initially, thinking about the seashore, the concept of this, from the concept of the seashore to the teachings of history, to to the meaning of cosmology and its applicability in cosmotechnics in its relation to law. But I would perhaps want to see if Professor Strang has something to answer to, I guess, to some of the questions that were raised by the panel itself, if you would be so kind. I mean,
I'm very reluctant to take more speaking space this morning because we have had such a rich set of contributions, and I don't think I can really possibly encompass them all, except to say how important it is to have this interdisciplinary set of perspectives on the problem, because, you know, Pietro is right. We need the historical understanding, we need the specific cultural understandings, we need the legal understandings. And so I guess that for me, this is a great big advertisement for disciplines talking to each other about these issues and sharing ideas. And I'm always wonderfully encouraged by how much common ground we can find quite easily on these things. So so we have a very rich set of ideas here, but I'd really rather hand over to the questions and the audience and to other voices.
Kia ora koutou, kia koutou mā ngā mihi kauana. That was an extraordinary panel, and you've left me thinking about a lot of things. I'm particularly, of course, moved by the turtle and the shark. Just one point to make about my culture and our relationship with water. One of the elements of English, British, New Zealand law that has recently begun to consider Māori customary practice is the implementation of rāhui. And rāhui is what happens when someone is taken by the sea, when someone is taken by a lake or by a river. And what we do in that context is we close access down. People are not allowed to fish, they are not allowed to swim, they are not allowed to go near the area in which that person was taken for 3 days. And after 3 days, a ritual is undertaken to settle the waters, to cleanse the area of that family's grief and the loss of the person. And that's kind of become enshrined in law in its own somewhat obscure way. It is still a common practice, though. So it's the beginning. There are many ways in which we have attempted, particularly at the local level, not so much at the national, to engage with the policymakers to effect good policy. I will say, though, that unlike other Indigenous societies, Māori have now got critical mass. We can make a difference. There are enough of us. Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. Kia ora.
I wonder if David wants to say something about the importance of history. David, do you want to say something? No. Okay. Yeah, so we can take questions, yeah.
Thank you. I'm Benedetta. I'm a visual artist and PhD researcher at Durham University. I'm focused on gender and sexual visualities in island and water spaces. I'm from Venice and so happy about all these wonderful contributions. And we got an ancient tradition here that is the sea wedding, the water wedding. And now it's nothing more than a folkloristic show for mass tourism, but till 200 years ago, more or less, the Doji was the head of the city. In a water parade, he threw a wedding ring in the water, and the marriage was set. Then when I grew up and started to be in the queer studies and gender studies, I started to analyzing the strong patriarchal and heteronormative nature of this right, establishing at one side protection and also a love relation between islands and the sea, but at the same time a kind of subjugation of a male for this female body. So my question is, in this project to develop an environmental identity, how do we deal with the gender question, because we come from a really strong, I mean, every culture has different gendered attributions to environment. So how can we deal with this? Will we able to manage the genderization, or will this environment identity help us to go to a post-gendered or non-binary identity? It's a general question. I'm happy to listen to all of you, of course.
I don't know, maybe Yuki wants to say that.
Yuki, do you want to say that?
Do you want to say?
Thanks for raising that, because I also have the same question. Because when we imagine a personhood for somebody, it's natural to think that, well, if it's a person, then how do we architecturally design this person? And the natural inclination is to base it on some kind of a gender ideal. But we also need to understand that nature is a reproductive body. If our understanding about nature is heteronormative, then we fail to fully accept and realize, this nature as being non-binary, and it's intersected, it's hermaphrodite, and it can, and like coral doesn't need to procreate because it can replicate itself, so until I think as human beings we understand the diversity of reproduction that is non-heteronormative, then we can truly realize the magnificence and diversity of nature. Because I don't think as human beings we have come to grips with how diverse nature is. I hope that's a good statement.
Absolutely. Yes. I think there are more questions from the audience. Oh, yeah.
I just want to just say something about the gendering and humanizing of landforms, because I think that was a really interesting question. At home we have a range of mountains, and they're massive and they're majestic, and they were all related to each other, and they all fell in love with each other, and they all fought, and one went far out into the sea, and one went far out to the east, and others remained in the center. And the object of their desire was this beautiful mountain, who actually fancied the most perfect mountain that was there watching her all the time. But he was gay, he didn't want her. So there's that story too. Mountains in my world are very gendered. You have boy mountains, you have girl mountains, and their names are carried with pride. So there is that element too. And the same occurs with waterways and with lakes. Anyway, sorry, that was...
Sorry, can I just add to that? Thank you for that, Ngahui. I just want to add to that it's really interesting listening to words like indigenous creation story and folklore, because we attribute indigenous creation stories and such as things that Ngahuia talks about has been very high knowledge. You know, while in Western culture, they see folklore in the hierarchy of Western knowledge as being no degenerate knowledge, unscientific. But you know, if I was to provide an indigenous perspective on how we see indigenous creation stories, is that our ancestors had to make complex ideas into metaphor in order to survive deep time. So I also highly encourage my Western counterparts to think about that notion of deep time and not necessarily look at your folkloric traditions as being child's play. Because there's a reason why they made into folklore, so they can survive deep time. And because, you know, they are metaphors for you to decipher, you know, your complex civilization, just as ours.
Absolutely. And I think, I mean, many people are involved in this kind of studies. I mean, I know particularly well the issue surrounding Chinese religion and the relationship between local religion and so-called high religion, in the case of, you know, the sort of the hegemonic presence of religions like Buddhism and other Pan-Asian religions. And of course, you know, there is always this tension between, you know, bodies of knowledge that are very much rooted in local practice, and including, you know, the gendering of the environment or the gendering of a particular phenomena, and the arrival of clerical mission and of organized religion, and we know which is a process that is still ongoing, and then there is, you know, sort of disentangling some of these processes, as well as in, you know, in the context of high modernity and so on is extremely complex. But absolutely, I think your call for, you know, for reimagining the epistemologies and the temporalization of these questions is really well taken, I think. Yeah.
So I would restart from the marriage, the marriage of the city of Venice with the sea. It's really impressive. So you read the formula, which is, I marry you, so now you obey. Something, I mean, okay, I'm quoting by, you know, approximately, but it's something like that. So you stumble and you think, okay, what do we have to decipher here? So I think that's one of the big problems. So so images, narratives, folklore, so stories that go across or come to us, and sometimes we decipher metaphors that we actually have to get rid of. So I say that because this is one of the big problems, to go then to the values stories carry with themselves, or images or metaphors, and with their action. So it has very much to do with the values or the common ground which we share and where we want to go to together. So I would mention one of my most beloved philosophers, Antonio Gramsci, who was a very engaged political thinker, first of all. And he said, the political struggle actually is a struggle, first of all, about the common sense. So that the ground for political action is intellectual. Political action is, first of all, common sense, because in common sense are the most entrenched problems of our societies. Then, second, religion. That's another very important terrain. It's largely shared visions of the world. So we also have to deal at that level, and I think we've been discussing both dimensions a lot. And then says, okay, and then philosophy. But philosophy is, for small elites, actually. So it's not really where the big clash finds place. So just to remind us, so Descartes, or the binary division is an important issue in the philosophical intellectual debate, but there is all these levels that are entangled. And yeah, thank you for pointing to the problems that are connected to it.
Thank you very much. I just want to say that as a philosopher, philosophy is for everyone and should be accessible to everyone.
That's also Gramsci's point.
Yes.
Everybody's philosopher.
Everybody's philosopher. If
the philosophy of the elites.
Sure, sure.
The one.
Yes. But I want to maybe comment on the discussion that happened here. Thank you very much for raising this issue, because from a climate justice perspective, this is exactly the issues that we want to expose and see how we can collectively solve somehow. So, for example, the issue of binary issues and gender issues, even if you look international law, for example, it is so patriarchal, it is so binary in its construction, even like the raw material they used is always this binary understanding and this patriarchal and this. So nowadays we do have a duty, all of us as scientists, as scholars, to actually expose these issues and see how we can actually progress and solve them. But it is true that everyone has a role in this exercise. Everyone has a role. I like the fact that we're an interdisciplinary panel, because even the fact that you mentioned the indigenous wisdom, nowadays it is starting to be recognized that indigenous wisdom has a lot to offer in this discussion in protecting the environment. And we look back at that. 2 weeks ago, I was in an oral consultation about the rights of future generations, like we say. And we discovered that there is an indigenous society that every political decision the council was taking was considering the 7th generations. So will that decision today be good for the generations to come? But these are issues that we do need to discuss. We do need to come together and see how we can improve them. And in my humble opinion, we are in need of deep structural changes. We can't look at this issue without acknowledging the systemic inequalities, without acknowledging what we call intersectionality, that there are different kinds of oppressions that needs to be exposed and discussed at the same time. So thank you very much for mentioning the gender dimension of this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that as long as we don't heal our relationship with nature, of which of course we are part of, it's going to be very difficult to heal on the issues of gender. Nature is non-binary, and the same attitude to see elements as resources or property comes from the idea of possession, of having rights on things, and I think that is the common root of many problems. So I do think that healing the relationship with nature, with Mother Earth, will allow us to heal all the relationships.
Yeah.
Let's not forget that indigenous people also participates in ecocide.
Of course.
And they're also actually the worst culprit that works alongside corporations towards the ecocide, because they're also seeking money. So, indigenous wisdom is one thing, but the actions of indigenous people don't necessarily follow indigenous wisdom. Sorry, that's it.
I think we can take one last question. It's 1 o'clock coming up, but yeah, we have a few more.
Okay, I have a last question. My name is Santiago. I am also a PhD student at Ca Foscari. And one thing that sparked the conversation is the role of stories. And I want to ask the panel, is really interdisciplinary, what is the role of stories in this discussion that we are having? Because we talk about the legal aspect, the philosophical aspect, but we can think each other as a privileged group when we are having this discussion. But what is the role of stories when we talk about a bigger population, a bigger public, to talk about these issues? Because working with literature or cinema, and the impact that they have in their vision and in the vision of the environment and our relation with that, is that it has a really, really deep impact. So I want to ask you that is, how do you consider relevant the role of stories and how we talk about these problematics to the world, to the rest of the people that live in Venice, for example, about these problematics? Thank you.
Oh, that's a whole new thing. Storytelling.
I know.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry.
Thank you. I mean, we do have some writers here. Do you want to talk about it? Chantal? No. Okay. Well, we have artists, visual artists are storytellers, I guess, of sorts. Can I say that? Okay.
What's the role of storytelling? I think the responsibility of the storyteller is to inspire. And I hope that that's what Talanoa Forum is doing, is to inspire, to aspire. And that's the role of artists.
It's interesting when you brought up storytelling, because it is very much of an old style thingy, right, which your grandparents do to you. But what is becoming increasingly clear in the field of international development, especially on the social side, that storytelling has now become a very important developmental tool, because this is how people convey their cultures, convey their aspirations, and convey where they want to be in development. So you'll find more often now that storytelling is now a major development tool. It's the cement which keeps aspirations clear and mobile for the future.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
If I may, yes, sorry. Okay. If I may add on as well, the role of storytelling has always been an ancient tool of which we could archive the best stories of our own indigenous knowledge and indigenous people. Keep in mind, writing was introduced into our culture, but traditional knowledge had always been passed down from generation to generation through storytelling. And I also find storytelling as a way for us to connect with nature and to identify with that we are all, we may see ourselves as human beings, but maybe the non-human beings see us as non-human beings. So it is, I would say, this is a personal perspective, that it is, the role really is about to identify with not just us as people, but to identify with what surrounds us as well. Yes.
Just quickly, we've heard about the positive elements of storytelling, but it is also, certainly in my world, a way of teaching and warning. So that when you're told, don't go near that place, don't walk over there, don't go into the bush at night, and then you're told a whole way of reasoning why not to do that. So storytelling actually is a way of regulating behavior, and it is a very powerful tool. And in the context of the environment, an extremely salient one, I think. Thank you.
Well, I think on this beautiful note, can I just cut you? Yeah. Thank you. Join me, please, in saying thank you to all. It's been amazing. The Talanoa, thank you to all the speakers, the students. Thank you to our lead speakers. Wonderful days, and this is a wrap-up. Sorry, Pietro.